working on sponsoring some talks around health, safety, and wellness. The first one we had was last spring on consent, and this year we have 3 talks scheduled, tonight being the first, around understanding anxiety and perfectionism in children. And we have partnered with an organization called Hallways to put on these talks. They work with many independent schools around the city, both parents, students, and schools, trying to give them tools to help them navigate social, emotional challenges of adolescence and such. So tonight we're lucky enough to have the director of Hallways speaking with us, Rachel Hennis. Did I say that right? Yeah, okay. And for those of you who were here last spring, Rachel led our talk on consent, so you know how amazing that was. So we're in for a treat tonight. And I'm just going to turn it over to you, Rachel. Please give her a nice welcome.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And I feel like come into my talks with me and talk about our program a little bit, because that was a great description. So I'm Rachel Hennis. I'm the director of the program at Hallways. I am joined by my wonderful colleague, Blessing Chandu, who is going to be co-facilitating the talk with me tonight. So we are going to kind of just jump in, I think, to the content here tonight. So a brief introduction for you. Can you hear me? Is that working? Is it not on? Not on. It's on. Oh. Is it working? No. Is that better? Okay. Yeah. So Hallways, as Christine had mentioned, we've been working with the independent school community in New York City for a long time through our parent organization, Freedom Institute. So some of you may have heard of Freedom Institute. They've been around for about 40 years. They're in Midtown Manhattan. And the larger organization focuses on drug and alcohol, outpatient treatment and recovery. And for about 30 of the 40 years that they've been around, they've had a school program that initially was started to support young people who had a parent or guardian in treatment, and has since expanded to really focus on social emotional wellness. And that's really because the research and the best practices around substance abuse prevention really is in line with ways that we work to prevent other high-risk behaviors. And that's really by promoting social and emotional wellness. And Blessing and I are going to talk with you tonight about kind of what exactly that means. So we're very familiar with the independent school community, kind of the nuances and communities and contexts and culture here, and we're really going to work hard to kind of ground our talk tonight in this community, knowing that there are a lot of particulars and specifics, and that there are some overall norms and pressures and strengths that kind of transcend some of the different communities within New York City. So in our work at Hallways, we look at individual behavior of students and individual grades, through a holistic lens. So what do we see coming up in students in different communities and in grades throughout the independent school community, and what are different factors that kind of contribute to what we see? So we're always looking at the role that adults play in the development of social emotional wellness for young people, and the role that school communities play. So a real holistic approach to that. And I want to just get a sense too in terms of, I know people are still trickling in, but kind of who is in the room. So if I can just briefly get like a show of hands of who's here that has a child in the lower school? Anyone? Oh wow, we got a lot of lower school parents. Okay, middle school and upper school. Okay. Oh, good. So we have a real mix of people. Okay. So our work primarily is with middle and upper schools. And I should clarify that for middle and upper schools, meaning kind of 5th grade through senior year. So a lot of the best practices that we're going to be talking about are really based in our expertise in those ages. They're definitely things that I think you'll be able to utilize, and I actually have a 3-year-old at home, so I'm a lower school parent myself, not here, and I utilize a lot of the best practices on a day-to-day basis with him. So I think they will be applicable, but just to clarify that that is our kind of frame of expertise. So tonight we have a lot to cover over the next little bit with you all. We're going to start with just providing a framework. What is social emotional wellness, right? Why is that important, and why is that an important framework to situate us all in together when we talk about anxiety and perfectionism? And then we want to dive in a little bit to what do we know about anxiety and perfectionism, how they kind of connect, how they operate separately, and then what does that mean in the context of the cultural context of affluence and high achieving independent school communities. And then lastly, we're going to spend some time kind of what can you do, right? What are some tips, tools, strategies we can give you that you can start using tonight, tomorrow, and then we're going to leave a good amount of time for Q&A so we can hopefully get some specific questions from you all. And I want to acknowledge kind of the level of anxiety that exists in our culture right now. We just had, this tragedy yesterday in New York City, right? And many of us were all affected by that, and some of us may be more directly affected by that than others. So I want to kind of acknowledge that we're bringing all of that in here tonight. Our children are obviously bringing the larger context of what's happening in our world right now into their day-to-day interactions. So we know this is a particularly challenging time and a really important time to talk about how do we support each other given that reality. So in terms of giving us a background, kind of some shared language and statistics here, I'm sure many of you are here because you've concerned about this. The New York Times article that just came out, I've had so many parents and teachers email it to me. It's a very frightening things that we're hearing and seeing, right? In terms of kids going off to college, and that's a long way away for many of you, but really feeling unprepared, having a lot of anxiety. And in our work at Hallways, we do assessments with different grades of students, and we see high levels of anxiety starting at very young ages. We also see very high levels of perfectionism and how they go hand in hand. So we see 5th graders crying about a grade on a test because they think that it's going to affect, every aspect of their future, right? So this kind of research that we see here about how it's rising, anxiety and depression, about young people feeling underprepared emotionally, we see that research playing out day to day within the community. And our real goal is to help communities bring in evidence-based, effective social emotional health programs. And luckily that's happening more and more. More and more the schools that we are partnering with throughout the city are really looking at what does it mean to help prepare young people, to help them feel more connected, to help them have the coping skills they need, not to just teach them kind of the facts and the top and more like topical content areas, but really get a little deeper and do some skill building and some helping them with value setting. I'm sure that's going on there. We'll just keep doing it. So while we see a lot of scary numbers, and while we see a lot of concerning kind of data out there, and we may see that in our children and in ourselves as well, we also see a lot of schools really prioritizing social and emotional health. So that's great for us and our children. I'm going to turn over to Blessing to talk a little bit about what is social and emotional health.
So, as Rachel mentioned, I'm really encouraged to be here tonight just because it shows that Bank Street's really taking the concern of promoting holistic wellness to heart. And the way that we kind of understand some of the information that's out there is that a lot of our young people are, at the time they're leaving home, really equipped with a lot of talent, a lot of intellectual prowess, but not the emotional skills to match that level of intellect and talent. So for us, social emotional wellness is really about giving students and young people the skills that they need to match their capability and to fulfill meaningful and happy lives in the world. So the way that we at Hallways like to talk about holistic wellness is thinking of risk factors and protective factors. And risk factors, as you might guess, are the things that sort of increase a young person's likelihood to engage with unhealthy behaviors. And then protective factors are the things, the characteristics that kind of help with a healthier, positive development. And so promoting the protective factors and mitigating risk factors are key. And I should mention, because I think when we talk about protective and risk factors, particularly with concerned parents or guardians, I think it can be difficult to think about providing a perfect or ideal home environment. And that's not what we're really espousing today. It's really about understanding that in any home, we're imperfect and things will come up, right? So one of the risk factors, for example, is family conflict. Every family is going to have conflict, but I think the ways in which we model for our young people how to engage in conflict in a healthy and constructive way can be a protective factor as well. Also, something important to mention that in addition to our work with parents, a lot of what we do in terms of promoting protective factors directly with young people in schools is about providing these workshops where we're focused on skill building and providing skills that that young people need that will help develop them emotionally. And I think where parents and adults in school can kind of come into play with this is also modeling these behaviors in school. I think it's really a community effort. It's not, while I think that the workshops are helpful and I think really important in terms of direct service work with young people, in addition, I think the things that can happen at home or be modeled by adults in school are also really key aspects as well. Also want to mention some of the protective factors that I mentioned: good coping, knowing how to relate well with others, having a sense of autonomy and independence, able to take healthy risks, are all the sort of things that we like to see as far as protective factors. So when we want to talk about promoting overall social emotional wellness, we tend to focus on some key domains: social skills, values, coping skills, environmental supports, and interpersonal connectedness. And so these are the things that we have seen tend to promote healthy behaviors in youth and reduce risky behaviors in them as well.
So we basically, when we're talking about anxiety and perfectionism tonight and some of the other unhealthy behaviors or tendencies we see, it's really that some of those risk and protective factors get kind of out of whack, right? And that really relates, that really relates to what we know and what the research shows us about affluent communities and the cultural context of what the research calls, the literature calls the cultural context of affluence. So historically, when we look at substance use, when we look at acting out behaviors like petty theft or cheating, when we look at anxiety and depression, right? We know that those behaviors and those problems are about twice as high in affluent communities. Kids in part of affluent communities have about twice the rates of those issues than their non-affluent peers. And so there's a growing body of literature and research that's seeing this and looking at this and saying, what is going on that kids that are in privileged communities are looking to be kind of the most emotionally challenged and compared to their peers? What is that about? And we know a few things of what it's about in the research. Now, this research has not been done here in New York City in the independent school communities, right? It's been done in many other parts of the country, looking at kind of similar communities, but not New York City. New York City has its own particular set of things. So we see everything in this research, and we've spent a lot of time pouring through it, playing out in the communities here, starting from very young ages, going all the way up to senior year. So higher rates, and why is that? Well, what the research shows us is that it is about this immense pressure for success, and particularly this immense pressure to demonstrate external markers of success, right? Being the best student, getting in the best, being the best on the sports team, whatever it is, extracurriculars, volunteer, well-rounded, all of the pressure that exists on young people to be the best. That this pressure and that focus on these external markers of success goes along with a lack of focus on internal intrinsic value. So young people start to see and start to believe that their value comes from what they're achieving as opposed to who they are, right? What they do as opposed to how they treat other people. And that this creates a lot of stress and anxiety in young people. And so we see in the research that up until about 7th grade, kids within the cultural context of affluence and kids that are non-affluent cultures have about similar, you have to excuse my breathing here too, as you can see I'm a little compromised there. So that kids have about the same rates in terms of anxiety and depression, in terms of engaging in risky behaviors. And around 7th grade, it starts to shift, and then it starts to skyrocket. We see girls, as they get older, have about 5 times the rates of anxiety and depression as non-affluent peers. And it really, and the rates really start to separate very greatly. So I want to also clarify that when I'm talking about affluent culture as a risk factor, it's not about coming from an affluent home per se. It's about being part of the cultural context of affluence. So whether or not your child is coming from an affluent home particularly, they are part of a larger culture that is not just Bank Street, but the whole New York City independent school system that would fall in line with this definition of what affluent culture is, right? So I want to kind of be clear about that it's not necessarily related to an income level in your home. It's related to this cultural context and the pressure that exists within that. So when we can't responsibly look at and understand anxiety and perfectionism and what's happening with our young people without really having ourselves situated in this information and knowing that what happens within this context is those risk and protective factors, again, they get out of whack, right? Because the focus becomes so much on external markers of success, intellectualization, knowing the right answers, getting the perfect grades, and less on the values of connectedness, empathy, coping, relationships. And whether or not that's something in your home, you might say, in my home, I'm not really focused on you gotta get the A, you gotta get the A. I'm so focused on how are you treating people, what's the quality of your relationships. And that's wonderful, and we're gonna talk about making that as explicit as you possibly can. But even within that, we have to understand how intense the norms within the larger community are and how intensely they operate. That kids can get that message that what's important is what they do, not who they are, even if we're working really hard to counter it at home. So within that context, do you want to tell us, Blessing's going to tell us a little about perfection.
So I think sometimes talking about what something is not, because perfectionism is one of those things that I think we commonly talk about and quite frankly often take pretty lightly. And so perfectionism, one thing I want to say, it's not a synonym for liking things orderly or neat. Or one of these things where, in a job interview when they ask you what are some of your challenges or area for growth, I'm kind of a perfectionist, right? So it's really more than sort of that fake flaw that we might throw out there. What it is perfectionism is something that I think can be that really difficult, ugly taskmaster. Some of us in this room myself, I'm going to be a self-admitted perfectionist here and come out before you all tonight. But it's one of these things where you have that internal critic that's always kind of saying, here's the standard, continue striving. There's never a sense of satisfaction. It's that monster within that's always ravenous and never satisfied, right? So a lot of that's externalized. It's all about what you're doing and accomplishing and how you're seen in light of that, wanting to appear like you have it all together. And I think the tricky thing is trying to parse out this idea of what it means, because I think, of course, as you all are raising young people, of course you want to push them towards having high standards of excellence, and wanting to be the best that they can be. But I think oftentimes we kind of conflate the two and don't have a clear distinction between what it means to work hard and do one's best, and also the perfectionism which strives towards unrealistic standards and says, I am what I do, and if I'm unsuccessful or perceived to be unsuccessful, then I'm not okay. So that's something that I think is really important to parse out. It's also really tricky because I think perfectionists can get a lot of external approval for what they're able to do. Some of the drive that we see in people and sort of push towards accomplishing results. There can be perfectionistic tendencies with that, and when you have a lot of external markers, whether it be from your family of origin, whether it be from teachers at school, or from the workplace, it kind of reinforces this notion of continuing to do and achieve because it feels good to get that validation. So I think in understanding perfectionism, it's important to not minimize it, but to really understand how it can take a hold and sort of be a mindset and identity that ultimately may not serve us well.
Okay, thank you. So some of what that looks like, what perfectionistic attitudes and behaviors look like. And I should mention, when we work with the various schools, and we're going to send you the slides too, but when we work with the various schools in our community, we do a lot of assessments. And one of the areas that we assess, and we use a lot of research around, like, what are those building blocks for health, for social emotional health that Blessing had mentioned before. And one of the areas that we look at is perfectionism, and how we kind of define it and what we think about are some of these things, like being very hard on yourself around mistakes, or being so scared of making mistakes that you won't try new things, or you'll avoid certain tasks, right? One of the things that we sometimes see is within students is perfectionism sometimes looks like the more traditional, type A, working really hard, staying up all night. Sometimes it looks like, I'm not going to even do my homework, or I'm not going to even do this, I'm not going to even study for this because I can't tolerate if I don't do well, right? So as someone, a child that used to work really hard, had some, didn't do well, had some mistakes, and then will just kind of write it off because they can't tolerate the idea of failure. So we see it kind of play out in that way as well. And it's really also about, often looks like, being highly critical, right? Highly critical thoughts, ideas, and that's part of what we're going to help you to hone in on and challenge when you see, and if you see that coming up within your child or within yourself, because so much of this is going to be about modeling. So it's really about control also, ultimately, wanting to be able to control however it shows up, your grades, what people think of you, your appearance, right? So all these different ways to kind of feel a sense of control, because that keeps you feeling like you're worthy. So underneath perfectionism can be a sense of, I, in and of myself, mistakes and flaws and all of my kind of messy humanity, am not worthy, which again connects us back to kind of that research around worthiness being kind of determined based on these perceived ideas of success. So that's how we really look at perfectionism, and we see it off the charts over and over in so many of the assessments that we do. We spend a lot of our time going from school to school, grade to grade in New York City, talking with young people about perfectionism. And they are very clear on many of them in many classrooms how this is operating for them and how harmful it is. So perfectionism is the striving, right? And what can start to kind of happen from that is this state of anxiety, this fear that or kind of consistent worry that things are not going to go okay, right? So it's this ahead of time worry, like I'm not going to do well on that, I don't think I'm going to do well, and then you take the test, I didn't do well on that, or I didn't do well on that. So it's a loop of worrying or fear of things not going okay, or not being perceived the way you want to be, that can happen before and after an event. So a healthy, okay, we all have anxiety, right? It's part of our fight or flight, healthy response of being human. And healthy anxiety is, there's a potentially distressful, problematic situation coming up, so I'm gonna plan for that. Then the situation happens, right? And then I move on. And I kind of let it go. That's kind of how healthy anxiety is gonna operate. But the kind of anxiety that we see, and that the New York Times article is talking about, and that we see in the classroom from young ages, it doesn't stop, right? It may subside for a minute, but then it attaches to the next thing. So it's not really based in the event. There's a thing that's happening, or there's something that's happening that I'm anxious about. It's a kind of chronic state of how we operate. And that's what we start to see happen and get tied really into perfectionistic attitudes. And this is obviously problematic because it can be, as kids get older and students get older, it can be really exhausting to have those thought loops all the time and to have it be kind of always on. And that can cause young people to engage in unhealthy behaviors as a way to kind of shut those thoughts down, shut those feelings down, get some peace from it. So a lot of the reasons for drug and alcohol use down the road that we see in this community comes from kind of wanting to turn some of that off, right? That's not the only reason kids use, obviously, but that's a lot of kind of what we see in the research and what we hear in the classrooms. So that's one place it can go. Another place that I think is really important, especially given some of the risks within that cultural context of affluence I was talking about, is that the more that this perfectionism and anxiety cycle happens, the more we start to feel that it's all about me, right? The more kind of inward and me-centered our thoughts and feelings become, as opposed to being external, right? And like centered on other people and on relationships. And so we hear a lot about like narcissism in these communities, and I, not putting any quotes to minimize it, I do think that there's narcissistic challenges that can happen. And I think part of what that's about is perfectionism and anxiety are all about, I'm not good enough, I didn't do it right, everybody's looking at me, this person doesn't, right? It's very me. And you're in distress about your own thoughts and your own emotions. And what that can do is really limit young people, all of us, but especially young people, from focusing on their relationships, being vulnerable, or being willing to be seen as vulnerable, and therefore developing a level of intimacy that's really sustaining for all of us. And also feeling really conscious of being grounded in kind of a larger sense of like connection and community and the world. It's a lonely, distressing place to be, to have a life feel kind of all about you and your grades and your appearance, right? It can, over time, feel very empty. And that's kind of what we start to see as kids get older in these communities especially, that there can be this feeling of like, if I'm not achieving and like getting that sustenance, that external validation that Blessing was mentioning, that I feel empty, right? So we want to, I think, really be mindful of one of the best ways to help kids move out of this mindset is to help connect them to us, to other people, and to kind of minimizing in some ways like the me in glaring letters that this can start to create. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about what you can do, and then we really want to spend some time with some Q&A and really getting some questions, talking through parts of this that you want to hear more about, and go from there. So, in terms of that, what you can do, I'm going to take my little breath here. So, one of the main things that we can do is really about affirming effort. And I'm sure that, especially for those of you that have children in like middle or upper school, growth mindset. We hear about it a lot in the community, and it's very important, right? This idea that learning, we learn as we go. We don't have some fixed what we know and what we don't know that we come to kind of life with and class with, right? That we can always kind of grow and continue to learn new things. So we really want to focus on the effort that our kids put into things and not just the outcomes, right? And also just celebrating learning and celebrating mistakes. I was actually, when I was on my way up here, I was talking to a good friend of mine, and she was in the car with her 2 young daughters, and I said, I'm actually on my way up to do a talk about anxiety and perfectionism. And she's like, oh, I could use that talk. And then she said to her daughters, do you think you guys are perfectionists? And they both said, yeah, I think so. And they said, but we love learning. And she said, do you feel scared to make mistakes? And they were like, no, we love making mistakes. And then the older one said, I don't ever want to make a mistake. And it was just this really interesting moment where I was like, this love for learning and making mistakes can really become at odds, right? Because that is how we learn. We know that, right? And so really wanting to encourage and support healthy mistakes, because that's part of how we grow. And some of that, and a lot of that, comes from looking at ourselves and looking at kind of our own language, our own attitudes. So we really encourage you, and I think I did the same thing for those of you when we were talking about consent. So much of this and so much of our talks is really about like inviting you to kind of look within of how are these things showing up for me, right? How is rigid thinking, self-criticism, I wish I had done that better, how does that show up for you? Because like Blessing said, and I will happily out myself here as well, I'm sure I'm not the only perfectionist in the room, that goes home from a day at work and says, why didn't I say that? Or why did I do that? And kind of mulls it over, right? Those are great moments, depending on your child's age. Give them those examples. I made this mistake today and I was really beating myself up around it. And then I realized X, or what did you, I know someone who does celebrating mistakes at their dinner table every night. And they'll say, what mistake did you make today? And what did you learn from it? And they kind of clap for each other, right? I love that. I think that's great. So how do we start to really model making mistakes, putting in effort, challenging our own negative thoughts? Those are the things that we really want to start to do with our kids on a regular basis. And you can do those starting from a pretty young age. We also want to, again, support healthy risk-taking. So one of the things in this community, this larger community, that I think can be really damaging, and the research shows is really damaging, is the idea of knowing, right? Our kids, that's what it's all about. Do they know the answers? And we go in these classrooms, when we observe classrooms, we teach in classrooms, it's about knowing, right? It's about knowing the right answer. And that can be, really challenging. So we want to talk about the importance of not knowing things, of being open to learning things, of not knowing kind of, certainly in terms of relationships and how other people are feeling, but also just being open and not coming from a place of knowing, but coming from a place of curiosity and learning, right? So I think that that's a big part of it. And then there's also what our kids really need to hear from us, which is that they can handle challenges. They can handle discomfort. Because a lot of what comes up here, and particularly again within this cultural context of affluence, is overestimating perceived dangers or threats and underestimating the ability to be able to cope with it. And we see that in our data. We see kids feel like they can't cope with things. They can't cope with the failure. They can't cope with the mistake. They can't cope with something that feels humiliating. They can't cope with the negative thoughts, right? And some of our children really may need some help with that from a professional, so I'm not kind of minimizing that, but I think a lot of our kids also need to hear us say, I believe in you, and you can handle this. It's okay, right? Helping them to try new things, fumble, and then support them in building up their own kind of self-talk around being able to handle it. So the other aspects of this, clearly we need to really always have the mindset that they are getting the message from their larger community, not necessarily Bank Street, but the larger New York City independent school community that is seeping into all of their lives, whether we like it or not. It is, in really good ways and in some challenging ways, that says you are what you do. You are what you accomplish. So we got to be like kind of hyper vigilant around saying to them, like really affirming, deciding on, and really being clear and explicit about our values. That our values are around who you are, how you treat people, how you treat yourself and self-care, valuing learning, all of these things, right? We want to really get clear on that, like what are the values that are most important to us as parents or guardians, and if we have a parenting partner, let's talk and see if we're on the same page about that in terms of values for our family. And then start to kind of have conversations regularly about that and see if your children perceive the values the same way you do. Because there's also some really interesting research that shows that even in families where parents feel, oh, that's so clear. It's so clear that like my values aren't about getting an A, my values are about kindness, curiosity, that kids perceive their parents as not having those values. They will say, no, my parents, the most important thing to them is that I get into an Ivy League college. Or the most important thing to them is that I get into, one of the best upper schools, high schools, right? So we want to kind of check in with them. What do they think are the things that are most important to you about them? And lastly, what I want to mention here, which is so important, and this goes back to the knowing piece, that one of the things that can get really hard about anxiety and perfectionistic thinking is the idea that when these thoughts happen, I'm a failure, everyone was looking at me, I always mess that up, I'm never going to now be able to do X. Those thoughts and the feelings associated with them can feel like truths, right? Not thoughts that come and go and we can choose how we relate to, but truths. And so when we see our child struggling with some of that, even at a young age when it's about, drawing inside the lines or outside, and I have a kid who wants to draw inside, so I'm already talking to him about what happens when you draw outside and you're upset about it, right? So it starts from a young age of starting to help them identify and challenge that those thoughts are truth. So we don't want to neglect or kind of not substantiate and validate how they feel when they get upset. I'm really upset I didn't do well on that test, or I'm really upset that, this friend's never going to talk to me again, or everybody thinks I'm a loser, whatever those kind of thoughts are that can come out. We don't want to say, like, that's ridiculous. We want to validate that, but we also want to introduce this idea that we can choose how we relate to our thoughts and they're not truths, because that's really one of the biggest markers of this ongoing struggle with perfectionism and anxiety, is relating to those really self-defeating, self-critical thoughts and feelings in the moment as the truth about me. So lastly is really giving them some alternative ways to think about it, and then talking about healthy coping. Model healthy coping. Tell them your stories. Like, I was really beating myself up, and then I said, you know what? That's not actually how I want to think about this. I want to think about this as I tried something new. I think it went okay. I'm going to get some interesting response and feedback, and now I'm going to go for a run and feel better, or meditate, or whatever your healthy coping strategy is. Like, verbalize those things to your children, again, in an age-appropriate way, so they can start to understand how to kind of reframe for themselves. So these are some kind of best practices, things you can start doing. We're going to give you also some really good resources that have great, actually, like activities about how to do these things at home, kind of each of these things. And, I think our main, and to keep kind of trying to do that on a regular basis, because it really is about like instilling these ideas on a day-to-day basis from a young age and talking through it. So we are going to go through some of these resources, but I want to first get your thoughts, get your feedback. It's a big space and kind of bring it in together. So I'd love to hear, and Blessing and I would both love to hear, What questions do you have about all this information that we just kind of presented? What resonates, what doesn't? What would you like to talk about a little bit more?